the way Christians have always understood the nature of God until just very recently has been this fairly consistent picture. But today that picture is changing.
Welcome, dear friends, to the Dink Bibles, or in English, Think Biblically podcast. And it's a podcast dedicated to equipping Christians with three things: the knowledge necessary for cultivating an understanding of the times we live in, and consequently to something that Tolstoy used to challenge his audience with, to think deeply on how then shall we live. Now, I am very stoked to have Dr. Richard Howe with us this day. Just a short introduction about our guest. He is a writer as well as a public speaker and debater in churches, conferences, and university campuses on issues concerning Christian apologetics and philosophy. Now, I met Dr. Howe for the first time a couple of years ago and I stopped using the acronym because people always thought that it had something to do with espionage or something. The Cross-Examined Instructor Academy. And we saw each other in July also at the Academia Institute in South Africa's Philosophy and Theology Conference. Now, I always, when I told people that I met you there at the conference and also in South Africa, I tried to explain what kind of person you are. And I always say, well, you are basically a stand-up comedian and you moonlight as a theologian. I don't know if you take that as an accurate description.
Probably less a theologian and more a philosopher, but maybe the stand-up comedy. Yeah, it works sometimes and it gets me in trouble sometimes.
Oh, that's awesome. You are also the Norman Geisler Chair of Christian Apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, also where the CIA conference this year was held, North Carolina. And there you also serve as Professor of Philosophy and Apologetics, and as, in this word I had to go look up on Google, Provost.
Provost, yes.
It means the Senior Academic Administrator.
Well, it means kind of different things in different contexts. We really have already had, before I became Provost, a Senior Academic Administrator, our Academic Dean, Dr. J.T. Bridges. But as my function as Provost is kind of a special advisor to the President and also Ambassador. So when Rebecca and I get to travel, we're always looking for opportunities to shamelessly plug Southern Evangelical Seminary as we go around. So that's the way we see ourselves. And that title, it was sort of, we were looking for a fluid kind of title when they were looking for this position. And we thought that one was broadly defined in a lot of different contexts, broadly enough to fit our agenda there at the seminary.
And how old do you need to be before you can qualify for being a provost?
Or maybe how young. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I was glad they didn't. I'm glad they didn't have that criteria.
Okay. No, that's great. And you are also the past president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics. How long were you with those guys?
So I was president for 2 years, and unfortunately for me, the scheduling has worked out such that almost every year when they meet, I have a conflict because of speaking engagements that I don't get to attend quite as often. But the ISCA, as it's affectionately referred to go back to the initialisms or acronyms and such, was something founded not too long ago, probably about 20 years ago. Norman Geisler, my mentor and the co-founder of Southern Evangelical Seminary, founded this as to really hit some issues in apologetics that were perhaps understandably maybe being overlooked by other academic institutions that celebrate conservative Protestantism in the U.S., like the Evangelical Theological Society and the Evangelical Philosophical Society. They're big enough maybe that a lot of things kind of slip through. They don't get attention that Geisler maybe thinks they should have, perhaps. So ISCA came along, and I had the privilege of serving as a president there for 2 years.
Interesting, and I'd like to know if I'm missing the mark on this, but it feels like in the last 10 or 15 or so years, there's been a revitalizing of interest in the apologetic world. I don't know if you've experienced the same sense.
Without a doubt. I think in some sense, because of the onset of technology, social media, probably everything that you could imagine as a category has experienced a resurgence, only because now people can communicate with each other more broadly around the world more easily because of technology like we're doing right now. There you are in Namibia, presumably, and I'm in the US, and we're having a real-time conversation. So that, I think, is part of the explanation. But I also think just before what we might identify as the beginning of a surge, at least in the U.S., of apologetics, I think you could say there was actually a decline of apologetics, at least formally studied in the seminaries. And my theory is, and I've never really done any research to confirm this, but Geisler told us back in the 80s that a lot of seminaries were dropping their apologetics, what little they had. Maybe they'd have an intro, maybe they'd have a apologetic systems course, and that's about it. That's the way Dallas Theological Seminary was when I was a student of Geisler. And I think the reason that they were dropping, if that's indeed the case, was because I think a lot of seminaries, apologists, were not sure how to respond to postmodernism. By the late 70s and 80s, the toxic thinking of postmodernism had now trickled down enough to be felt at just the marketplace. And now when people say, well, that's true for you, but not for me, I think a lot of apologists weren't sure how to respond to that. And I think they made the wrong decision to think, what we need to do is, since no longer people are asking these standard questions that apologetics used to pose, like, does God exist? Is the Bible reliable? Then we need to change our content. All they needed to change was the way to deal with new questions like relativism of truth. So once that then began to get injected into the conversation, I think a lot of apologists began to go, okay, we do have a response to postmodernism, so let's get back into the fray and resume our arguments.
Yeah, so I studied at Stellenbosch, Faculty of Theology, and we were openly discouraged when I wanted to do a master's in apologetics, Masters of Theology. In apologetics, I was openly discouraged from doing this. Granted, it's a very liberal university and a faculty, but it took me a bunch of years, and also to connect with some of the younger generation of apologists, Frank and Elisa and these kinds of people that you also know as well, and then discovering this whole world of apologetics that's been going for 50, 60, 70 years.
Right. Yeah. So I'm glad you found that, as did I. I mean, I had to go through a trial in my faith, having become a Christian at 16, wasn't raised in the church, and I lost my faith intellectually, at least, at university. And it was apologists like Norman Geisler, Josh McDowell, R.C. Sproul, through their various platforms, way back in the cassette tape days. Some of your viewers may remember cassette tapes. And it was apologetics that really renewed my faith. So I came to reaffirm what I had affirmed before, but began to learn why. And then that's what gave me the love for apologetics, because I saw what it could do in the life of somebody who was already a Christian. It's obvious the role it plays in evangelism. Apologetics used to be called pre-evangelism. But it wasn't quite as obvious to some people, perhaps, what it can do to somebody who's already saved. But that's what it did for me. It was like a life ring being thrown out as I'm drowning in this confusion of liberal theology and skeptical thinking and such. So I love it. And I love to see what it does for people in bolstering their own confidence in their faith.
No, I had quite the same experience when rediscovering apologetics. And it also, I think that was the platform or the stepping stone that got me back into systematics as well. So really a theological awakening by just getting into apologetics again. Now you mentioned your wife and you and Rebecca, in your spare time you like to travel and find any excuse to travel. So
especially to South Africa and
especially to South Africa. Yeah, very adventurous.
We've got Namibia on our radar screen. We want to come there as well.
Yeah, and I'm trying to really turn Simon Brace, who've always also been on the podcast, trying to get him to bring you guys over here for a seminary or a conference or something. So we're looking forward to that possibility. Just to introduce the series and the topic again, the title of the series is Ideas of Consequences. We're going to say something about that in a while. The reality is that ideas have good consequences and some have bad consequences. And in this series, we are investigating the big ideas that are currently shaping our culture and also influencing our churches especially. And we are doing this from different spheres of inquiry: social, cultural, political, religious, economic, and academic. And today's topic is the God, or let's say gods, of contemporary theology. Now, when we met again in July, I asked you if you know Matthew Barrett. You said you know about him. You've not met him yet, but he's got the Credo podcast, and the slogan for his podcast is "Theological ideas have consequences." Now, would you say you agree with that? Theological ideas have consequences.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just a subset of the broader ideas have consequences, because it's easy to identify the deleterious effects, practically speaking, of bad ideas. You know, the fascism of Hitler, or the Marxism of Stalin, or the Maoism of the Chinese and such, and how many millions of people were killed because of that. I saw a video once, an animated video talking about the issues of evil in the world and such. And the narrator said, because we didn't fight it at this level, and it showed a picture of Mein Kampf, we had to end up fighting it at this level, and it showed a picture of the tanks on the battlefield in the Second World War in Europe. So ideas have consequences. Now, when it comes to theological consequences, or ideas, theological ideas and the consequences, I think there's a sense in which it's even greater, given the implications that what we think theologically can have and will have eternal consequences, not just consequences in this life of physical life and death, but ultimately spiritual life and death. So most definitely, I think that what we think about God, for example, which that's what theology is, isn't it? It's a study of and knowledge of God. What we think about God. A.W. Tozer said, what a person thinks when he hears the word God says probably the most important thing about that person. So absolutely, I think it matters what we think about God and his ways and his will.
And I think that's something that I find in today's, let's say, very materialistic, postmodern type people is very flippant about their theological commitments, and I think bought into this idea that, you know, we're gonna come to that, but this idea that there's no real world consequences when we think theology. You know, that's something that you do privately in your room, and most people's theological depth also ending at, you know, God is love, and we can't explain how or why we believe that. It just sounds nice, and I've heard it enough to reiterate it. And I think that's I don't know if that's your experience also there in the evangelical circles, but especially here in our mainstream church circles in Southern Africa, that's probably one of the biggest reasons why the church is looking the way it does, engaging with culture the way it does, is because we lack theological depth, and we don't take the consequences of a lack of theological depth very seriously.
I think you're exactly right, and I think it's a symptom of a issue of how Christians, or for that matter, even religious people broadly, have understood the relationship between faith and reason. Historically, they've been categorized, or nature and grace in some context, perhaps, faith and reason. And you can see in the Middle Ages that both Christianity and Islam had to come to terms with this, scattered over maybe a century, where they needed to decide exactly, is there a role for reason, and how does that fit in with the role for faith? And Christianity, by and large, chose there's sort of a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. And it really opened up medieval Christian Europe to new ideas. The battle over whether the sun was the center of the universe or not, or solar system or not, with Galileo and Bellarmine battling this out. And Christianity was open to the scientific evidence. It was open to new ideas in politics, private property rights, diplomacy as international relationships, new ideas in various things about how economics function in terms of capitalism or whatever. And I think that it had a lot of implications for the eventual flourishing of Christian Europe, whereas Islam chose, by and large, against reason and subjugated reason to faith. And it arrested, I think, the development, at least of Sunni Islam. And they're still fighting the way 9th century countries would fight one another, take their stuff, and that's how you grew as a country, rather than diplomacy and these things. They're still trying to establish the caliphate. Now, what I think has happened since then, though, to get back on topic specifically for us as Christians, is with, again, I mentioned postmodernism. One of the things I think that some aspects of postmodernism has created is this idea that, well, the things of faith are personal and private, and that they're sort of like your love life with your spouse, or your personal feelings and emotions and such. Whereas reason is scientific and external and has to do with thinking and such. That kind of mischaracterization of faith and reason, despite the fact that we chose the right way of understanding them back then in the Middle Ages, now we've kind of drifted away, has I think created generations of people, certainly in the United States, where religion is a private affair. They talk about, well, you don't want to get into those kind of things. And you could probably pick a lot of examples of things that are a private affair. His taste in music, you don't want to criticize someone else. They like this kind of music, you like that kind of music. It's rude to just berate their kind of their taste in music or their kind of cuisine that they like. Those are rude to do that. You leave to each his own. Well, then it just gets transferred even into things about God. And so all of a sudden, well, what they think about God, that's their private business. And I think that's done a terrible thing to the public spread of the objective truth of the Christian faith, because now the Christians, by and large, aren't even thinking of it as an objective truth. They think of it as an experience that they have. And there are lots of things that caused that in America, exacerbated the problem with the Finney revivals and the prayer breakfast movement and the Bible college movement. These things in the 19th century sort of fed this emotionalism in the U.S. I'll let someone else speak to how it flourishes or languishes in other countries in the world, but it's something we're still battling in the churches to try to get people to care about the content of sound theological thinking.
And I think one of the problems that I've discovered in the last couple of years, especially in our context, is and maybe even in a wider context, is people have a very inept historical consciousness, and you've spoken about how this thing developed throughout the Middle Ages, this idea of science and reason, and I think a lot of false narratives have been created with different agendas, or maybe just not knowing the facts, and in the end, that has brought about this discouragement of speaking about God and theological ideas in public spaces. And one of the serious topics that we discussed a couple of weeks ago here at our church is where people would say, just keep politics out of the church, and keep the church out of politics. And I think the problem with that, as I understand it, is because everything has been made political. If you have to keep out of politics or keep the church out of politics, we as Christians should just, we won't have anything left to say.
Exactly. No, that's right. And it's not, in a sense, it's not our fault if these things have been made political. But given that they have been, they certainly have in the U.S., then it's impossible. No one has a scalpel sharp enough to carefully divide the political aspect of, say, abortion from the theological and ethical and philosophical aspects of abortion. They flow together in ways that I think is nigh near impossible, practically speaking, to separate them. So I think sometimes I can understand why someone might say, let's don't get into politics. There might be some level of politics that becomes so attenuated that it's doesn't matter that much. But the implication is nothing matters at the level of the political. And you go, well, that's certainly not true. And this is especially the case. And again, other countries may have a different way of framing the problem and framing the solution. But in the U.S., at least historically, we pride ourselves over the fact that government is of, by, and for the people. One of my pet peeves that I'm getting a lot more of them as I get older. One of them that I've developed recently is I hear so many of my fellow Americans use the expression, our leaders. Oh, we need to pray for our leaders in Washington. I go, they're not your leaders. They are your servants, because the government is a servant of the people. That's how the U.S. has understood the government there. But now we're acquiescing to its power and its agenda to set for us. And I think we can't do that. We've got to be salt and light, and we've got to affect change in our culture. So especially in the US, since ostensibly the government is of by and for the people, then it's a matter of stewardship. If that's the way it's set up, then if we don't try to impose not the right word, infuse our theological values into the political sphere, we're more or less abrogating our responsibility as citizens, because God gave us that opportunity to do that. It's your government. What do you want it to be? Okay, well then let's make it what it needs to be. But we've sort of resigned ourselves to this machine out there, and there are a lot of reasons about that. They were boring, perhaps, to non-Americans, but nevertheless, we have to be good stewards, at least. Now, Paul wasn't he didn't have that option. He couldn't say, well, let's all campaign and vote for a different Caesar. So he had to just acquiesce and more or less keep a low profile and not go on protests and against the government. He just quietly, as much as was in him, to be at peace with all men. But if you live in a country where the government is ostensibly, at least, in your hands, then you would be remiss not to try to be change agents in making the place more morally virtuous in every way you can.
America is always interesting or entertaining, but it is never, not interesting. So, and I think what you are speaking to is what we want to get into with the conversation is I think the propensity for modern people to compartmentalize different facets of society and of their lives and stuff. I spent a couple of weeks listening to Francis Schaeffer, also a big 20th century philosopher and theologian. I listened to 4 of his audiobooks, and he's got this main theme that he expounds upon running through all of these books, and that's the idea of the two-story worldview, where and you've spoken to science versus reason, where we've compartmentalized these two things. And I suspect that they've been, up until, let's say, the 1700s, before the scientific revolution, they were always seen as two parts of a whole, much more holistic. And what Francis talks about is how modern man have taken these two things apart, putting faith in the upper story and reason in the lower story. You can, and you also spoke about grace. Grace also been put in the upper story, and nature in the lower story. The body in the lower story, mind in the upper story. So what I would like to ask you, because you've been around longer than me, is why would you say we've compartmentalized these two things that have before, let's say, 400 years ago, have always been seen as a whole, as two parts of a whole?
Yes. Well, thinking of them as, in a sense, two parts of a whole is motivated by the fact that Christians understood that all of creation was made by one God. And so he superintends it, and he's providential over it and sustains it in being. So it's really one theater, if you will, with one major distinction between creator and creation. But I think this nature-grace dichotomy, or the upper story, lower story, or faith and reason, however one wants to label it, it's just that just is another way to talk about what Schaeffer had put his finger on as a very big problem. And it relegates issues of religion to this non-rational. That's another characterization that Schaeffer points out, that by and large, this upper story is non-rational. Now, it may not irrational necessarily, like it's contradictory, but just unassailable by the faculties of reason, with something we can't reason and think about. Whereas this lower story of nature then is eminently rational and something. This kind of idea has led to all kinds of deleterious practical effects. And I mean, we could go through some of them that at least I think I've seen with the help of those who've gone before me, but we've already mentioned one of them, that it's created this mindset among some that issues of religion are not rational, they're emotional, let's say. And so they don't submit themselves to rigorous analysis of truth and error. It's more analogous in their mind to a romance. You even have writers who talk about the romance. Well, of course, it's silly to talk about the love you have for your spouse as if it's some kind of scientific subject matter that you can analyze and put in Venn diagrams and categorical syllogisms. I mean, that sounds like it's doing violence to the robust nature of love and romance. Okay, fine. But it can't be the case that everything about our lives that matter is that. We're certainly not that way with our health. We don't just say, well, it feels good, so it's okay to follow this procedure medically or that one. We go, no, what is the objective truth? What procedure will literally take care of the problem? And we need to be that way about these spiritual truths and theological truths. But this nature-grace, this nature-grace dichotomy has contributed to that kind of dichotomy, that religion relegated to the non-rational. And it's given rise to even something as extreme as scientism, where scientism is this idea, and think about it, if there was this upper story that is non-rational, let's say for the sake of argument, and it isn't assailable by our faculties of reason, if that's true, then there's really then only one of several options. One would be, well, what's the difference between that and there just not being that upper story? There just is no such thing as that. Everything is just nature. And that's what the scientism does. So you see people like Peter Atkins and his debates that he's had with John Lennox or William Lane Craig, who just has no concept, or Richard Dawkins is another, A.J. Ayer would be a more sophisticated version, that just has no concept of God or quote unquote religion, because it doesn't seem to be real at all. That's one extreme. But think about this, not to jump ahead, but you also, I think, have from this sort of false understanding of this dichotomy, that some people go, oh, yeah, it's non-rational, but the way you access it is through mystical experience. And it's no coincidence that we've seen, certainly in the U.S., a burgeoning since the 60s onward of this role that consciousness-altering drugs, meditation, all of these mind science cults, all these mind science religions just began to flourish because they thought, oh, the way to access the religious realm is not through thinking, it's through this mystical experience. So you have these two so different implications and applications, if you will, of that same false dichotomy, to say the upper story is not real at all, or it's real, but we can't access it through the powers of reason. So I think Schaeffer in his The God Who Is There, where he introduces that, at that point he doesn't really do a sort of a diagnosis of how that happened. It's just a matter that it happened. In Escape from Reason, however, then he begins to put some names to it, and this may or may not be interesting to reviewers. I think he gets wrong who it is that caused this problem, and he's actually famous among contemporary philosophers for the fact that he blames Aquinas, because everybody smiles and goes, no, that's absolutely not Aristotle and Aquinas, what you're talking. It's really Kant and all the things that led up to Kant. Now, in a sense, it might not matter. Okay, so however it happened, here it is, and let's deal with it, which I would agree. The problem is, I think some of the solutions to this thing would come from the very person that Schaeffer would have said is the cause of the problem. So people then would not look to this classical tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas if they've been influenced by Schaeffer, because they think that's where the problem arose. It's not where the problem arose. It's actually where the problem is resolved and is remedied, if you will. That's jumping ahead, perhaps, but I had to get my little dig in there for Aquinas, given that I'm a
Thomist.
Evangelical.
No, I think I might be wrong, but I think it was Norman Geisler that wrote the foreword to one of his books, and he also mentioned this. He said that he think he got the whole thing with Aquinas wrong, but the diagnosis of the culture we find ourselves in today is absolutely spot on. And just to pile on what you were saying, so if the upper story is accessed by experience, that means it's extremely subjective, and in that sense, you can just relativize the whole thing. You know, so everything they've put in the upper story, and it's become it's become almost like a trash heap for the postmodern people. Everything they creating controversy, they just throw into the upper story and say, no, it's very subjective. It's based on experience, and therefore you can relativize it. Stuff like religion and
gender.
Gender, yeah, gender. The whole thing about gender, and everything. Basically, you can have a well-developed opinion about. And can challenge someone on. They say no, that's in the realm of subjectivity, which basically stifles any kind of meaningful dialogue or debate you can have about a bunch of these topics because it's so subjective.
Right. Absolutely. So we've got to be able to gently encourage our fellow believers to see the viability of sound reason with respect to the things of God. There's you were talking earlier and something came to mind. There's a resource that people might run into rarely. Stephen Charnock's Discourses Upon the Existence and Attributes of God. Not a very appetizing title. I joke with my students, that sounds like a page turner. I got to see how this one ends, like it's some just scintillating novel. Okay. Well, today, at least in the U.S., the only place you would ever encounter that work by Charnock would be in a graduate level or above study in theology or philosophy of religion or something. But the book is actually a collection of sermons that he preached to 17th century English farmers. So it's a commentary, and you can take almost everything I'm saying practically to be in the context of myself as an American, but it's a commentary on American Christianity, the dearth of depth. I submit to you, if you took Charnock and preached that level of depth in a typical church in America, they would run you out. It is too deep. It's over my head. Now, certainly if you did it instantly, it would be too deep. But the point is, how did we ever get to the point that kind of theology was, quote, too deep for church? Isn't that where it's supposed to go? At least to really feed the soldiers who were fighting the spiritual war, right? But it didn't happen overnight. It certainly didn't in America, where we've begun to languish and then almost have a repulsion against depth in theology. I heard a preacher on this subject basically say to his audience, and presumably it was a mixed audience. He wasn't in a church when he said this. So it made more sense that he was speaking to people from multiple churches. He said, when was the last time you heard a sermon on the Trinity? Knowing that probably if he asked for a show of hands, very few hands would go up. They would not know what the Trinity is. That's why nobody gets disturbed when they see heretical Trinitarian views starting to get traction within the conservative Protestant context. It should be alarming what's passing, not only the Trinity, but also the hypostatic union, the two natures of Christ, what is now getting a pass in terms of what used to be considered heresies in church history are now some of your mainstream thinking by mainstream theologians or apologists. Something happened to get us here, and I think Schaeffer's exposure of this false dichotomy, which really is, as I mentioned Kant, it's really, I think, the implications of Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction that he brings up, whatever that means. But just for the geeks out there, probably most of your viewers may be geeks in deep theology and philosophy and stuff. But at any rate, it's Kant's phenomenal noumenal distinction, not Aquinas's. He doesn't have that distinction between the upper story and lower story, the way it's characterized. But it does happen, though. It's out there for sure.
Now, we've also got a lot of farmers watching this channel, living in Namibia. Everybody's basically farming somewhere or in some way. So yeah, that's good news. And this basically makes it very clear why. And this was the next question. How has this led this dichotomy between the objective and subjective and relegating a bunch of very important topics to the subjective realm? How has this led to the exodus from classical and Protestant theology to what we find today in most mainline churches and all the more in or more and more in evangelical circles, the liberal and progressive theology? How would you say, how did this help this shift to occur?
Yes, what's interesting, this I think has happened in theology as well as philosophy, that you have maybe an idea that comes along that people begin to worry about the deleterious influences, say it's a bad idea. So someone else comes along as a, quote, response or, quote, solution to that previous bad idea. But what it does is just make the matter worse. And you see this pattern, certainly you see it in philosophy, where a philosopher's views begin to entail a skepticism that people understandably rebel against, only to offer a solution that itself begins to lead to a skepticism. So I think this has happened in theology. For example, you have with Darwinism and also with the rise of higher criticism in Germany, you have this increase in academic, what we would label as liberal theology. Some of it even being infused with almost an atheism, if you will, that you had New Testament scholars who probably didn't even believe in God, who were scholars of the New Testament. And so, a lot of liberals, they may like that theology, whatever, but a lot of the conservative Protestants in Europe, especially in Germany, didn't like that and thought this had dire implications for fundamental truths of the Christian faith. So you see someone like a Barth come along. And Barth, for all of his efforts, was trying to preserve orthodoxy, or with a small o, that not Eastern Orthodoxy, but sound theology, a core truth of sound theology. He's trying to preserve those things. The problem was he comes up with a model of how to understand special revelation, written revelation, if you will, revealed truths through the prophets and apostles and ultimately the Lord Jesus, what we now refer to as the Bible. He's trying to preserve the core of orthodoxy by coming up with a new way of understanding the role that the Bible plays in doing theology. For what purpose? Because he was wanting to go, let's arrange it such that our method will preserve things like the existence of God, the incarnation, and Jesus died for our sins. And then we'll let the rest of the world take anything like the historicity of Genesis, whether it's 6 days or whether, evolution. We'll let them have all of that. Higher criticism, Moses didn't write this, Peter didn't write that. And they go, we'll let them have all of that. Their science can do whatever they want. Let's make our method immune to the findings of the natural sciences. And I think for all of his efforts and for all of his piety that motivated those efforts, I have no doubt he was a pious Christian man. The method that he devised, I'm not so sure it didn't create bigger problems than the original liberalism would have done if we just let it run its course. Because he introduced this way of understanding the scriptures such that what the revelation of God is the encounter you have with God when you read the scriptures. Well, that's relatively immune to whether or not Peter wrote Peter, 2 Peter, whether or not Moses wrote Genesis. All those kind of questions are interesting academically, but they're nothing religiously, a Barthian might say. It's this experience I have with the Lord. Well, history has shown that if you leave those other questions, those quote unquote scientific questions, as if they're separated from the upper story. See, there's that thing. If you leave those things separate, eventually that toxin and acid is just going to eat its way down and begin to ruin even the lower story, so that people will come to embrace evolution and higher criticism and stuff. And of course, all the theological implications of that. Now, it gets even worse, perhaps we can get to, in terms of how, because a lot of this European 19th century liberalism wouldn't last a minute in some conservative Protestant churches, right? But there are sort of versions of that are not only surviving in some conservative Protestant circles, they're being championed in that are, I think, even more subtle than the flagrant liberalism, let's say, of a Bultmann that Barth, I think, was responding to primarily.
Yeah, I think in some circles in our denomination, that high criticism, Protestant liberalism has almost been accepted as a new kind of orthodoxy. And we are not even having those discussions anymore. It's canon, and the implications for that is the big shift that has happened in the last, let's say, 20 years, since 2002, where this has been cemented into our decisions that's been made on the General Senate stage. And now we are basically, we're not discussing authority of Scripture anymore, or interpreting Scripture this way or that way. It's okay. We've accepted this now. What is and this entails we should keep ourselves busy with stuff like activism and a lot of these leftist, very very progressive talking points and stuff. But like you said with Karl Barth, Francis Schaeffer also speaks to that and says that in trying to rescue theology from rationalism, empiricism, he moved God to the upper story so that God would be immune to scientific inquiry, and that basically created more problems than it solved in the end. I've had a bunch of discussions with leaders again. Are we leaders or are we servants in higher positions in the church? What would you say?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we have an institution in the U.S. that sort of in an odd kind of way almost operates as a quasi-magisterium among conservative Protestants, and that's the Evangelical Theological Society. So it was founded in the 1940s. Most disciplines of study, engineering or the natural sciences or social sciences, they have one or more societies where the scholars within that industry would get together periodically, let's say once a year, peer review papers and networking and camaraderie and such. And so some American evangelicals, conservative Protestants, started the Evangelical Theological Society in the 1940s. And so now it has grown to several thousand members, and it's pan-denominational. It's the professors of the seminaries as well as some of the pastors of the churches and stuff. They get together once a year, and they have virtually every aspect of Christianity has got somebody writing a paper about it, whether it's an individual, whether it's a movement, whether it's a theological concept, a church practice, whatever it is. And for most of its history, it's been a barometer, if you will, a sort of an indicator, if you will, of the health of American Protestant conservative thinking, evangelical, as we use the term, as such. And so it's alarming. For just as an example, in 2003, they came to a vote in the society. Now, I'm not a member of the Evangelical Theological Society. I'm a member of the sister organization, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, which Norm Geisler helped found in the middle 70s. Again, just these are sort of the philosophy geeks. We're doing this, but we're also evangelicals, because that was also a thing that began to surge with this surge of apologetics we mentioned earlier. But at any rate, so in 2003, what had been happening for several years before it was the increased popularity of open theism, the idea that God cannot know future contingent propositions. That is to say, God cannot know what you would freely choose to have for lunch tomorrow. Now, in his omnipotence, he could make you have something for lunch. He could know that he's going to do that, right? So he can know future events like the second coming, because that's his actions, right? But he couldn't know your free actions. And they have their sophisticated arguments, not only philosophically and theologically, but also exegetically, interestingly enough. And there was a movement within the society to go, this is not really consistent with a high view of Scripture, inerrancy of Scripture, the term that gets bandied about a lot in the U.S. And it came to a vote in 2003. I was at that meeting because EPS, Evangelical Philosophical Society, Evangelical Theological Society, we meet concurrently. So I was there in Atlanta when they had the vote, and the vote was not to remove the three members who were brought under a charge of being inconsistent with the doctrinal statement because of their open theism. So what that was at least at the level of the largest consortium of academic conservative Protestants in the United States, that was a tacit acknowledgement of the legitimacy of open theism, which I would argue, maybe I can lobby for another invitation to come on. We can talk about some of these particular things at another time. But I would lobby that open theism is inconsistent with not only a sound biblical view, but also a sound philosophical view of the nature of God's omniscience. So they say they still believe in omniscience. They just requalify what it is that constitutes an object of knowledge, right? So God knows everything that's knowable, but they think future contingent propositions are not knowable. I would contend that that's inconsistent. It's not biblical, it's not historical, and it's not philosophical. But despite that, that's now tacitly endorsed by American conservative Protestantism as being within the boundaries of that. And I just go, okay, this is a symptom of a bigger problem. And that's not the only example that could be given. Open theism is the most flagrant because it actually came to a vote. I'm sorry to say, I don't think any other thing could actually come to a vote anymore because it wouldn't cause enough of a ripple. Back to your point about it's just canon now, in many ways. So now it doesn't even cause any kind of perturbation or disturbance or anything because of that. So it's job security for you and for me and for others who are trying to fight this fight. But we need to get more people on the team to really fight for sound theology in this regard.
You said it's a symptom of a larger problem. What would you say? Because I've always, the last couple of years since I think about 2020, I started my YouTube channel when I really suspected something is very wrong in our denomination, and since then you get a sense of what's wrong. But how would you define the bigger problem? What would you say lies behind all of this? Like Schaeffer called it the new theology in the 1940s and 50s. And a lot of, after the postmodern era, a lot of progressive theologies, and it's actually just gotten a lot more fuzzy and a lot more. They got children and grandchildren, all of these movements. What would you say? What is the big thing behind all of this?
So I love this question because it gives me the occasion to deflect what I think is an inadequate answer that would be common among people that I think of here in my ponds in which I wade here in the U.S. And that's this. There's a federal organization in the U.S. known by the acronym OSHA, O-S-H-A, which stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And it's a federal agency that's in charge of workplace safety for those industries that fall under its jurisdiction, okay? So imagine you've got a warehouse where a worker falls off some scaffolding onto the concrete floor and gets injured. Then likely what will happen is OSHA is going to show up to do an investigation as to why this man fell. With the seat belts or safety belts rather not used? Did he not get trained in how to use them? Were they worn out? They're asking these kind of questions. Now, what would not be the right answer, I think, if they went to the warehouse foreman and said, well, how is it this guy fell off the scaffolding? What would not be the right answer, as far as what OSHA is looking for, is for the foreman go, oh, the reason he fell is because of gravity. It's like OSHA's going to go, oh, gravity, that's it, and check the gravity box. That's why he fell. No. They're not asking why do things fall broadly and globally. Of course, everything falls because of gravity. They're asking, in effect, why does gravity prevail in this instance? That's kind of what they're meaning. So by parallel, I've seen people, if you ask a question like you ask it in a certain context, well, what's the global problem? They're going to go, oh, well, it's sin. Yeah, I know sin is the problem. That's the problem of everything. Just like gravity is why everything falls, sin is why anything evil or bad happens anywhere, whether it's an idea or an action or whatever it is. Of course, that's the case. Of course, Satan is behind it. Of course, we know that, but that's not what we're asking. Why does sin prevail in this situation? Now we're asking a more concrete, tangible question that I think can be addressed. And this part is the part of our talk that becomes a little bit more self-serving for me as a philosopher, because we've talked about the nature grace and that just the upper story, lower story, non-rational, rational, those kind of potentially misleading dichotomies that Schaeffer did such a great job of alerting people to. We've talked about that, but then the question can be, well, where did that come from? I mean, I see that that's a problem, but that just didn't pop out of nowhere. And I think Schaeffer's also in principle on the track of what the problem is, namely, it's philosophical to a large extent. It's philosophical. Now, as I've already said, I disagree with who he thinks that philosophical tradition is, and I don't think that's just merely academic. It's okay. He should have said Kant when he said Aquinas, because I do think that if you don't understand what the philosophical problems that created the issue are, then what one may go to propose as the solution may be just as inadequate as the answer they gave as to the cause. And I, for all the respect I have for Schaeffer, I think in some respects the solution that he, or at least the broader camp of presuppositionalists, what they offer in response is just an inadequate response, which is their presuppositional apologetics. I mean, he makes explicit reference to it, and I think How Should We Then Live, taking that cue from Tolstoy you quoted earlier, in his book by a similar title, he moves the then in the syntax there. But he goes into, I mean, he gets explicit about the problem is the presuppositionalism wasn't there. If, all was there at the time when this started impacting the U.S. was the classical approach, and the classical approach, and I go, oh, well, now, wait a minute. Now, those fighting words, as we would say, because I think that's wrong. I think the problem is a philosophical problem. I do a presentation. You see how I pepper these little hints here to try to see if I can cajole you into asking me back someday down the road. I do that with every chance I get. I pepper these little things. I do a presentation on this, thinking maybe
I'm taking notes. I'm going to get you back here. Yeah.
But I do a presentation titled God Fading Away. People can go to my website, richardghowe.com. There's another shameless plug, and follow the resources tab to get a PDF document, which are the slide deck of the presentation if they want that. What I tried to do there is give a profile of classical theism from the church fathers up until really the 21st century, but including a lot of the Reform luminaries of in the Dutch Reformed tradition and in its path into the U.S. through the Princeton theologians, Hodges, Warfield, these guys, Gerhardus Voss, and others. And so I try to paint this profile of a classical view of God's nature, not his existence, but his attributes, and then show how those are now beginning to drop off one at a time, like buoys on a boat. You throw one over and they're all tethered to one another. All of a sudden, some of the others start flying off. So I've already mentioned open theism, which I would argue is a displacement of omniscience. But the Clark Pinnock, who was part of the open theist movement, in the last book that he wrote, interestingly titled Most Moved Mover. And so your philosophy viewers should recognize that as a slam against Aristotle's most moved mover and Aristotle's argument for God's existence. He's got the most moved mover, and it was his defense of God in this open theism. Interesting, in that book, he begins to entertain the possibility that maybe God has a physical body, and he gives his arguments for that. And I go, okay, so how would that ever even come on anyone's radar screen to consider that God has a physical body, unless you were influenced by Mormonism or something like that? Why would a conservative Protestant ever toy with such a notion? I think there are a cascade of influences, and I think by and large most of those are, or at least the ones that loom largely in my mind, because I'm a philosopher, most of them are philosophical. Since the onset of the 17th century, you see this philosophical trend that has had this corrosive effect in its parallel applications in theology. Last point here, Romans 1:20 says that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. How? Being understood through the things that are made. So Paul's appealing to the Romans to know that the attributes of God are things you can know by reasoning from creation to creator. And he goes on, interestingly, in Romans 1, when he indicts homosexuality, he doesn't appeal to Leviticus 20, which is what we would probably do in certain contexts to show that clearly the Bible condemns homosexuality. But to the Romans, he appeals to nature, men doing that which is against nature. Because whatever the Romans might have thought about Leviticus, at that young stage of their Gentile Christian life. There's something that they cannot deny, and that is they're part of God's creation. They're part of nature. They can't retire their membership in nature. And so he appeals to this common ground, not neutral ground, but common ground, to make these arguments for the existence of God and the attributes of God and God's morality, which he goes on to do even in chapter 2 of Romans, appealing to the works of the law written on the heart. So that's my self-serving segment on the role that philosophy needs to play, I think, in the conversation. Not exclusively, but part of the conversation in contending with these bad philosophical and theological ideas.
You're talking about the name of your presentation being God Fading Away. And
yes.
Like I wanted to say a while ago, with my conversation with the church leaders and the theologians in our denomination, is they call themselves Barthians, and in the sense that God is so transcendent, so utterly other with regards to our human experience, that he effectively becomes incapable to communicate himself to us, and to communicate his will to us. So the narrative that these people have in our denomination can be described as the most we can muster regarding this absolutely transcendent God is awe and wonder at his mystery. And I think you put your finger on another reason for this rise in mysticism and that experiential theology, because God is so different from me. He can't even communicate rationally to me himself and his will. And one of the prominent progressive pastors in our denomination, especially prominent in a lot of the task teams and on the Senate floor, he was asked in an interview, "Who is God to you?" And his answer was, "God always feels like the greater reality, that which invites me to something bigger, more beautiful, and more loving. It is something that pulls me upward. I see it in the expression of love across boundaries. I experience God in people." How would you say should we evaluate that from a biblical perspective, Christian perspective?
So my initial reaction is I think it's a recipe for disaster, because there's no way to adjudicate. As Norm Geisler said, you wouldn't be able to tell who false gods if you don't know enough about the true God, because there are quote unquote false gods out there, and there are malevolent spiritual forces and or entities out there that are seeking to devour the Christians. And so we have to be vigilant to know what to open the door to and what to close the door to when it comes to these kind of experiences. And you mentioned Barth. You're perhaps familiar with the debate he had with Emil Brunner. It was a written debate over natural theology. Natural theology historically has been this branch of theology that tries to show what can reason show is true about God's existence and nature, apart from special revelation. What can we just know by our careful attendance and sound attendance to God's revelation of himself in creation? It's the Romans 1:20 passage, or Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, or Psalm 94, the heavens declare his righteousness. Psalm 103, as well as Acts 14, talk about God's revelation of himself through his providence and his superintendence of his creation in these things. So a sound, reasonable attendance to those evidences can then begin to inform us about the existence and nature of God. Now, I think it's true. I think everybody would agree that there's no way we can comprehend God, that is, wrap our minds completely around his being, given that he's transcendent and infinite. Of course, we're finite and can't do that. There are aspects of quantum physics that are still baffling to contemporary physicists. It would be an odd thing if there are some things about quantum physics that are beyond our ability to fully fathom, but we've got God 100% figured out, the maker of that quantum physics. That would be an odd kind of state of affairs. So I don't balk at the notion that there are things about God that are beyond us. But what I do think is, okay, from there, where can we go? Well, there are two things that are relevant. I've already mentioned the sound reason that there are, and this has been talked about for centuries in the church, even before the problems we're trying to address now even occurred with the postmodern and all this upper story, lower story. I mean, there's been a sense in which it's been around since the Garden of Eden, perhaps. But I'm saying that as a major thing to be dealt with in the church, the solution to it was already in place, I think, in this classical tradition from the church fathers up through finding its zenith in Aquinas. Protestantism was a lot more vulnerable to departing from that tradition than Western Roman Catholicism was. And so that's why I think a lot of Protestants have a problem with Aquinas, because it makes them think that it's Catholic. But a deep dive into early Protestant thinkers like Peter Martyr Vermigli, for example, or Zanji, is that his name? Is a new one that I just had started reading about. Contemporary of Bucer and Calvin and these guys, they were heavily steeped in this classical tradition. So at least that commends it for consideration, because it's not inconsistent with Protestantism. It was never considered to be inconsistent with Protestantism. It's just that Protestantism was a lot more vulnerable to competing philosophical voices than some segments of Catholicism were allowed to be. Be that as it may. So Barth had his debate with Brunner. I commend that. It's in English translation, but probably all of your viewers not only probably don't even need it in English. They can all read the German, probably. I don't know. You're all fluent in German, perhaps. You can read the original German. I can't do that. But Barth was adamant. I mean, the name of his response to Brunner is Nein, just, with an exclamation point, no. And he has no lack of invectives, Christian invectives, against natural theology. So that's one side of the thing. And we can, again, that may be a subject for another conversation. Well, what does that philosophy look like, and what are its methods and tools? And so the other then, of course, that this is more direct, I think, to Barth as the influence and how to answer that is a sound understanding of special revelation. So you got general revelation that gives rise to natural theology, special revelation that gives rise to biblical theology, and then natural theology and biblical theology together give rise to systematic theology. But if a person has a compromised view of special revelation, and by implication, then a compromised view of the nature of the written word of God, then that leg of the stool, if now we've only got two legs, so a stool metaphor might not work here, but nevertheless, that prop is gone. And I think that's what happened with Barth, where he tried to deny the fact that God gave propositional revelation through his prophets and apostles and such. I mean, this plagues American Christianity. It in people like Jack Rogers and Donald McKim and their very important book on the New Testament that spawned the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy as a response. And this idea that thinking of the Bible as propositional truth is an Enlightenment intrusion. It has nothing to do with enlightenment. It's Aristotle, if you want to ground it in anything. I mean, Aristotle's not Enlightenment. It's like 400 years BC. And the church fathers thought in terms of logic and reason and such. That these things aren't antithetical to being the Christian, but to the degree that we can tamp that down as a way of thinking, then to that degree, what we conclude from our thinking begins to really languish. And I think despite his best motivations, I think his motivations were pious and holy in the appropriate sense of the term, but they nevertheless were crippled, and it created a bigger problem than it solved. As Kant created a bigger problem than solving Hume, which was an earlier thing in philosophy.
It's basically an inversion, and that's something I'm studying at the moment for my thesis. An inversion of the traditional view of the imago Dei, the image of God, as Calvin put it. It's a knowledge of God that gives me knowledge of myself, and the inversion is knowledge of myself gives me knowledge of God. That's basically the argument I hear from these progressive people. The more I understand myself, and now you've also got this splintering of gender and identity and all those things. I think there was a paper that came out of the Reformed Church in America, the New Brunswick classes, where they said the more we learn about ourselves, the more we learn about God. And what we've learned about ourselves is, and by extension about God is bisexual, transgender, and non-binary, and
they're looking in a mirror is what they're doing.
It's basically creating God in our image. That's what they're doing. So yeah. you being a Thomist, and also have given a nice pitch for the classical view of God during our talk so far. How would you give an elevator pitch for the classical view of God? That's and maybe just explain where this idea of the classical view of God comes from.
So, wow, that's an elevator. So how many stories does the building have in it? How long will the elevator ride be?
You guys have got big buildings over there.
Yeah, it's interesting because you find contention for these, what are classified as the classical attributes of God. You find contending for that right away in the church fathers. In fact, even in the scriptures, you find contention for that, defending God as being the God that we identify as the classical God of classical theism. And we've coasted in Western Christianity. We've coasted on that for centuries, and nothing was disturbing that at all until about the beginning of right around the 17th century, and Protestantism began to be very susceptible to these competing voices. So that now, if you just said to somebody, if I just said to somebody, hey, science has proven that the universe began to exist a finite time ago, so it must have had a cause. I think most people go, well, that sounds like God to me. Who else is in the business of causing universes except God? And so he's obviously timeless because he created time. He's obviously spaceless. He created space. He's obviously immaterial because he created matter. So now you got a timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause of unimaginable power that must have chosen to do it because the effect isn't eternal. So it must have been a choice to create the universe. That sounds like God to me. And right there you have a handful of fundamental attributes of God. Well, now all five of those are called into question in some quarters in contemporary Protestantism. So it's tough to give the challenge to try to give, as you said, the elevator speech version. The challenge is we've gone so far away that you can't even call from memory of people. They don't even remember a time in the church when it was any different. At least some people don't. When it wasn't just the feeling I get on Sunday morning, and that is my relationship with God, and that is God, is this intense piety that I feel with the music and the rousing sermon and things like that. And that's it. I've exhausted it, and that'll get me through the week until next. That's a hard thing to counter in my experience. So my elevator speech would be something along the line. Then, if it came up, I go, I think. Well, the history of the way we filled decaying teeth from the first century has been fairly uniform until just recently. And people go, yeah, and aren't you glad we changed it? Aren't you glad that we've got a new way to fill teeth? And some people are that way about theology and such. And we've moved beyond this stale scholasticism, and they got all these kind of way in which they inveigh against it and all their ad hominem. It's cold scholasticism. One thing that I do want to add, because I should have said it a minute ago, just to kind of round out the story, because I know I'm talking too long here, but it's so Bart and this God is so transcendent that all we have is this, like the quote you gave, this sort of encounter that I have. But what I think is then the other side's response, granting that God is that transcendent, is how has he revealed himself to us? So just to make that clear, he's revealed himself through creation, arguing from effect to cause, and then he's revealed himself through his prophets and apostles in the Lord Jesus. So when it comes to a deep philosophical reflection on, well, how can I understand the nature of God humanly, given that I'm finite? Aquinas, that's where Aquinas' doctrine of analogy of language comes in, which allows us to make both positive and negative statements about God. Positive, God is love. Negative, God is immaterial, right? We can unpack those in a very thick kind of way along the contours of how analogous language. Analogous doesn't mean metaphor. We don't mean that. There's a difference, but nevertheless, there's a system called analogy of language that allows us to track a robust natural theology coupled within a biblical theology through revealed truth. I think that's the way we can do. And so Barth doesn't offer anything that we already didn't have a better version of in the first place, in my judgment.
We spoke about this at the Academia conference about the difference between when speaking about God, speaking analogous and speaking metaphorically. And I think that is and you had some fancy words that you what was that words again?
I probably made something up.
No. It was the discussion that was in Aquinas' time.
Yeah.
I'll try to remember. But
yeah.
But I think that's the big problem in a lot of these church debates, church conflicts, is we don't understand the difference between analogy and metaphor. Everything is now a metaphor. Instead of analogy, and someone I don't remember who said this, but you also touched on that. We don't have comprehensive knowledge about God, but we do have true knowledge of God, and I think that's where analogy helps us, and metaphor just takes us off the track.
Absolutely, and the thing is, whatever else one might want to say about analogy, all it is a proper application of two prior philosophical conclusions that one would come to, and that is the nature of reality, God, and creation. We talk about the metaphysics of that. How do we understand the creator-creation distinction? That's one. And then the other is the nature of human knowledge. What does it mean to know? How do we come to know? And so all analogy ends up being is the proper connection between the two. Since obviously we don't see, hear, taste, touch, or smell God, right? But we don't then think that there's no knowledge of God. We're absolutely agnostic, the way a Kantian may suggest, which I think Kant was another precursor to this tradition that gives us the Barths of the world and such. So that's what Aquinas is doing, and he's playing off actually Aristotle. Believe it or not, he just sort of sanctifies and he baptizes and sanctifies a lot of Aristotle to make it fit his Christian conclusions in some respects. And I think he does a good job of that. But anyway, that's what analogy is. It's how do we connect a sound understanding of human knowing and a sound understanding of the nature of God and his relationship to creation. And that connection there is his doctrine of analogy. And because one or both of those gets compromised, in my estimation, one or both of those get compromised, then what follows from that is concomitantly compromised and incorrect, in my judgment.
Now, in just the last question, we are currently, and I think I told you this, currently there's the split in our denomination between the people that's trying to reform back to the classical view of God, the classical high view of Scripture, and the other side that's just going along with this progressive trajectory. What would you say? What would be what should be the focus if we are going to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves? What should be the focus to recapture the orthodoxy in a mainline denomination? What do you have anything you can help us with?
I think as a practical matter, sometimes this can create more problems than it solves. But I think very often trying to take advantage of felt needs. I'll give you one example that happened at our church. Parents at our church, one of their children, teenager, began to date a young man who was Mormon. That created in the parents a concern that they didn't have until they saw the danger they perceived their daughter was in, because they at least knew enough about Mormonism that it wasn't Christian, but they didn't know really anything about it and how to answer the arguments. But I would submit, and I don't even remember the parents, this was many, many years ago. They may not even still be at our church for all I know. It wasn't, presumably before that happened, before their daughter started dating a Mormon, it never even occurred to them to be interested in Mormonism. They wouldn't have come to, hey, let's have a Sunday school class or a Sunday evening or a Wednesday night or whatever session on the cults or the new religious movements. It wouldn't have likely dawned on them that that was even important to do until they had that felt need of their daughter. And it actually is a real need, but they needed to feel that it was a real need. So anytime we can take advantage of felt needs that are tethered to real needs like that, then it gives us an opportunity to begin to, hey, let's have a conversation about that. Let's have a Sunday school on that. Now, thankfully, there are some people in most contexts who already care about these things, but they're being malnourished in their particular setting because that they're not getting fed. Those people, I think, you give them a little push, little nudge. Hey, by the way, we're having this discussion there. I'm there. And they're already there because they're already motivated. Would that's the way most people were. But I think we just have to get people to see why this matters. Back to the very first thing that you were talking about, namely the consequences of the ideas, and then more narrowly, the consequences of the theological ideas. This may make a difference in where someone spends eternity in someone's life. And if they don't see that that's a need, I'm not so sure there's anything that could be appealing to them if they don't care about eternity. In other words, there may be some people out there, the Apostle Paul in Acts, for all of his efforts in preaching and defending and alleging and contending, he got 3 different reactions in the book of Acts. Some people believed, some people did not believe, and some people wanted to hear more. And I think we can expect no less in our endeavors. Some people are going to go, I'm there. I want to learn this. Let's go have lunch together and talk about it, or let's have a formal teaching on it. Some people are going to go, it's not for me. I think this is wrong. I think it's enlightenment. They'll have various ways of dismissing it. I think it's man's reason versus God's reasons or whatever. So some people disparage it in that way. But then others go, I'm not sure. Maybe what's going on? What's this conversation? And they'll want to hear more. I think we can expect no less than what Paul got in his endeavors in the book of Acts.
So good and consistent content connecting with people on an emotional level.
Yeah, if that's what a felt need is, it can do that, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And of course, that only works if the answer we give them is actually the real answer, not just another emotional answer, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what happens more often. People have emotions like, hey, I'm feel kind of energyless, and I know, here's a great, roaring song in our church, and it's going to get you so fired up, and here's a sermon bereft of any content, but you'll feel so good. And they feel good, like a Joel Osteen. People feel good when they leave. So all he did was meet people at a felt need, but he just gave them more of the problem, namely they're living according to their felt needs and not their real needs. But if you can connect the two, like the parent who felt the need that her daughter need to be rescued from Mormonism, is also a real need that you need to understand what's true about your Christianity and false about these false religions. So if we can connect those, I think then we've got a good recipe, at least in some context.
If people would like to get to know some of your content better, you mentioned your website. Is there any other place that I'll put the website's link in the description of the video below? Is there any other place that they can get in connection with you? Absolutely. They can go to ses.edu. We're all into initialisms today. We got CIA and ISCA and SES, a Southern Evangelical Seminary. That's the website of the seminary, and my seminary address is rhowe@ses.edu. But also on the web page, my website, richardghowe.com, you can get me at info at richardghowe.com. And either of those. But I invite people that, I'm not a web developer. If you've already been to my website, you already can tell. Okay, it's a pretty static website, but I think all the links are working. And so all the resources there that you can have
from multimedia to written documents and things on theology, Bible, philosophy, apologetic, and such. And then the seminary, our courses are not only there for degrees, but also non-degree audit classes, which are pennies on the dollar. And so check out what we have there. I teach a number of courses in philosophy. In fact, I've got one coming up in October on classical philosophy. I teach on the new religious movements, which is the kind of academic term for cults. Now we've got a more innocuous sound to it than cults. And also teach the world religions and various electives here and there at anywhere from the undergraduate to the PhD level. So invite people to ses.edu. And by the way, interesting factoid here, just as of this week, the seminary has now moved. And so now we are in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So North Carolina, South Carolina are adjacent states. And where the seminary was in Charlotte is just above the state line in North Carolina. We've moved pretty close below the state line into South Carolina now for a lot of different reasons that nobody really cares about. But anyway, Rock Hill, South Carolina, but you still get us through the web on exactly the same place.
It's not going to be a longer commute for you from home.
It's funny. It's a different commute, but it's time-wise almost the same, believe it or not.
A change is good.
So it's weird. Yeah.
I'm gonna try and convince your wife to let me have you on the podcast again, and we're gonna see if we're gonna get Simon to bring you up to Namibia, and hopefully we're gonna have a.
I would love that.
Yeah, and I think I already got you hooked when I told you we're gonna do some animal watching and eating a lot of meat and stuff. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and for your wisdom and the depth of the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.